K-12 economics. Good afternoon. I'm Mr. I'm back with you today. We are taking on the international trade. In there, the focus will be on the terms of trade as well as the foreign exchange market. Remember, on our previous session last week, we covered on the same topic, the foreign trade, taking the reasons for international trade, both the demand and supply, and also we took on the balance of payment. We explained the balance of payment in detail, including all three sub-accounts of the BOP. So we stopped it there. Today we go further to complete the topic under macroeconomics. So the main focus is given, like I've said, on terms of trade and also the foreign exchange markets. So please join me. Let's see what we have in here. So these are the lesson objectives that will be achieved during the course of this lesson. This lesson will equip you to understand the following terms of trade. If we talk about terms of trade, we refer to the index of export prices to the index of import prices. We mainly compare the export prices to import prices. They help us to see how competitive are our exports in the foreign market. The foreign exchange market. Here we'll be discussing the mode of the currencies, exchange rate. The focus will be put on different types of exchange rate, namely the free floating exchange rate, the managed or controlled floating exchange rate, as well as the fixed exchange rate. We'll also talk about the difference between these three types of exchange rate systems. We'll also discuss currencies that are influenced by market forces, which are capable of appreciating and depreciating, and those that are influenced by authorities, which can revaluate and devaluate. So this is the lesson body. We have terms of trade that we call TOTs. And then we have the foreign exchange market. This is our topic number 4 of the macroeconomics. So that means this is the end of our macroeconomics according to our exam guideline, as well as our annual teaching plan. So the terms of trade, they mainly depend on export prices as well as import prices. They focus on the two. We compare the two. We compare export prices to the index of import prices. Then we discover if terms of trade are increasing or decreasing, or if they remain constant. A brief story about the terms of trade. So they are very important because once we know how to calculate terms of trade, we'll be able to see the trend of terms of trade for the country over the period of time. It also indicates the competitiveness of local industries in the foreign markets. If our terms of trade are increasing, that simply means there are more foreign earnings that will be received on exports. And that is good for the country because we regard that as the social welfare gain. As we receive more money as a payment for exports, that income can be used to improve infrastructure, to create more job opportunities. So there will be welfare gain in that situation if terms of trade are increasing. But if they decrease, we call that the welfare loss. Why? Because as terms of trade decrease, that means there is less income earned on export or less income received as payment for export. For that sake, the country cannot even further its infrastructure development, cannot even further improve job creation because the income received has been reduced by the decrease in terms of trade. So terms of trade are very much dependent on import prices as well as export prices. So what can affect export prices? Remember the currency. If ever our currency is depreciating or losing the value or becoming weak, that will mean our exports will become relatively cheap in the foreign market. They will be mostly affordable. For that sake, what is going to happen? Our goods might be highly demanded abroad, only to find that local firms spend a lot of money producing those goods, but now the returns will be lower due to the fact that exchange rate will have been depreciated. So that will be decreasing our terms of trade. And then what can cause terms of trade to increase? If the currency appreciates, it gets strong. The export prices will be increasing. resulting to more foreign earnings on exported goods and services. However, the increase in terms of trade in that case can only occur in the short run, depending on the elasticity of demand for those exported goods and services. If goods we are exporting are relatively elastic, that means they have perfect substitute abroad. They can be easily replaced. They can easily be replaced because they have substitutes. So that will create a bad effect on our terms of trade in the long run, because if they are replaceable, that simply indicate that terms of trade will be decreasing in the long run, but they can only increase in the short run. So appreciation will lead to the increase in terms of trade in the short run. In the long run, they can decline depending if our goods that we are exporting are relatively elastic or they are inelastic. And then we'll also move to the calculations of the terms of trade. So the table will be shown, calculations we've done to show you how to easily calculate. Normally, it's worth 4 marks to calculate terms of trade. So it is very important for you to ensure that you are able to calculate terms of trade and show all calculations. Then we'll be moving to currencies and the exchange market, where we'll be discussing appreciation of the currency, depreciation of the currency, undervalued currency, overvalued currency. Also intervention by the central bank to strengthen the weak currency or undervalued currency, or also dealing with the overvalued currency, because currency must not be overvalued, must also not be undervalued. That will create a problem for the economy of the country. So we say terms of trade is the ratio or the index. So we say is the ratio or index of export prices to the index of import prices. We compare prices of exports with the prices of the import. The change in both import prices and export prices affect terms of trade. So if ever, let's say, export prices are increasing, that will mean the country will be having more terms of trade, because there will be more return or more income earned on exported goods and sales. However, that can only be for the short run if goods are elastic. Also, the change in import prices, if ever import prices are increasing, that will be decreasing our terms of trade, because if import prices increase more than export prices, that will mean the foreign terms of trade will be increasing while our terms of trade locally will be decreasing. Terms of trade are used to forecast the foreign trade and the country's competitiveness internationally. So they also ensure that they monitor how effective or how competitive is the country abroad. If ever terms of trade for the country are increasing, that means the country's exports are very much competitive in the foreign market. But if terms of trade are declining, that means the country's exports are not competitive in the global market. As terms of trade change, they affect export earnings either negatively or positively. So if ever they change, they always affect export earnings. If we talk of export earnings, we talk about the income earned from exports abroad. So if ever terms of trade are increasing, there will be more export earnings, which can only happen for the short run if goods are elastic, they are easily replaceable. But if goods are not elastic or inelastic, that will mean even in the long run we'll be coming across the increased terms of trade. Remember, if goods or if our exports are elastic, we mean they can easily be replaced. They have perfect substitute in the foreign market. But if they are inelastic, that means they don't have perfect substitute in the foreign market. Even if their prices are increasing, they will be demanded at the high volume. So that simply indicates that they cannot easily be replaced abroad. The increase in export prices. The improvement in terms of trade is caused by increase in exports prices or decrease in import prices. So we focus on the two. If export prices are increasing, that will be increasing in terms of trade. And if import prices are decreasing while exports are increasing, that will also be increasing in terms of trade. So the main focus is not on goods, but it's on the price for those goods that are imported and those that are exported. This increases the economic welfare because more revenues is earned with the same expenditure. So there will be economic welfare if ever export prices increase faster than import prices. More revenues will be received by the country. In the long run, high export prices may result to decrease in sales volume depending on the price elasticity of demand, and therefore result in less income being generated by exports. So like I've mentioned before, depending on the elasticity of demand, if ever exported goods are relatively or are elastic in the foreign market, they are very much competing with other goods and services, they can easily be replaced. So that will be decreasing in terms of trade in the long run. But if ever goods are not, exported goods are inelastic in the foreign market, they cannot easily be replaced. That will simply indicate that terms of trade will remain high in both short run and long run because goods will be demanded. A loss of welfare might then occur. If then terms of trade are decreasing in the long run, there will be a welfare loss. We call that a loss of welfare. A decrease in import prices. A decrease in import prices is an incentive to local consumers as they pay less. Remember, if ever import prices are decreasing, local consumers will find it very cheap to afford imported goods and services. This increases welfare because expenditure on imports is less than they are cheap. So, as imports are becoming relatively cheap, less money will be spent when they demand imports, local consumers. Over the long run, welfare may be lost in the cheap, if the cheap imports compete successfully with local goods. So remember, if ever imported goods that are cheap keep on, competing effectively with the locally produced goods, that will be bad in the long run. That will result in local firms even shutting down because they'll be facing that high competition abroad. It can happen that imported goods are basically the products of dumping. So if goods are the product of dumping, they are sold at the lower cost per unit than in the country of origin. So in that case, that creates a problem because that can shut down local firms because they cannot afford to compete easily with firms that are selling goods that are selling at the lowest possible cost. That will be causing problems and people will be losing their jobs due to the fact that there's a high volume of imports that are relatively cheap within the economy. This may decrease local production and reduce welfare due to job losses. Yes, there will be welfare loss if ever import prices are decreasing. So initially there will be welfare gain, like we mentioned, consumers will be spending less on affording more imports. However, if those imports can compete successfully with the locally produced goods, that will lead to people losing their jobs within the economy. Those workers that are employed to produce locally will then be losing their jobs. For that sake, that will be leading to welfare loss because losing the job, that will mean there will be no income for our local labor force, and then that will mean the declining standards of living caused by the fact that there are more cheap imports that are flowing in, which are demanded by local consumers instead of demanding the locally produced goods and services. Declining terms of trade. So a decrease in terms of trade may be the result of changes in imports and export prices. A decrease in export prices. Welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce the bigger volume of exports that were needed to compensate the fall in their prices. If ever export prices are decreasing, that will make our export to be cheap abroad, which will lead to less foreign earnings as payment for exports. That will be decreasing our terms of trade. It's not a good thing. An increase in import prices. Remember, if ever import prices are increasing, that simply indicates that there will be less demand for imported goods and services locally, but locally produced goods and services will be demanded because they won't be highly expensive compared to those imports. Welfare is lost because more resources were used to produce more units of exports to finance high cost of imports. Changes in import and export prices. If export prices rise relative to import prices, meaning they increase, there has been improvement in terms of trade. So if our export prices are increasing compared to the import prices, that will mean there will be a rise in terms of trade OTOTs. A unit of export buys relatively more imports in that situation. Generally, this leads to an improvement in living standards as imported goods appear cheaper to consumers. So if imported goods are becoming cheaper to consumers, that will be improving their living standards. However, it will be bad if ever those foreign goods are competing effectively with the locally produced goods and services, resulting to local consumers not demanding locally produced goods, but demanding imported goods and services. If import prices rise relative to export prices, there has been a decrease in terms of trade. Yes, if ever import prices are increasing faster than export prices, terms of trade will be decreasing because there will be less earnings from export, but more earnings on imported goods and services. Generally, this leads to declining living standards as foreign currency earnings are relatively lower and imported consumer goods more expensive. So as we export goods, our goods will become relatively lower and we receive less earnings, while import will be receiving even more revenues from South African economy. So which are the factors that influence the terms of trade? We talk about the exchange rate. So a fall in the exchange rate reduces terms of trade. This because declining exchange rate will make exports cheap. So look, if exports are very, very cheap or are relatively cheap, that will mean there will be less earnings on exports. So let's check. Let's say the currency depreciates. So it loses the value. What is going to happen as South African rand loses the value? Export prices will decrease. And for that sake, that will mean exports will be cheap. As exports are becoming cheap, there will be less foreign earnings. Foreign earnings on imports will be decreasing. And then that will mean our terms of trade are also decreasing, caused by the fact that our exchange rate has depreciated. But if ever the exchange rate appreciates, that will mean our currency become relatively strong. If it becomes strong, there will be more earnings on exported goods and services because exports will become relatively expensive. However, I've explained that might happen only for the short run because in the long run, if our exports are relatively elastic, they are easily substitutable abroad. That will mean our goods can be replaced easily in the foreign market, resulting to what? Resulting to the less demand on those goods and services. And then if ever currency appreciate, like I mentioned before, that will lead to the improvement of the terms of trade. And then if our firms are becoming more competitive abroad, we talk about competitiveness of local firms in the foreign market. As our firms are becoming more competitive in the foreign market, what is going to happen? So if firms can compete easily in the global market, that will mean our firms are able to have their export being sold abroad at the high volume. They become more competitive. That will mean the price for exports are relatively high, meaning we have more earnings that we are able to receive on those exported goods and services. But if they become less competitive, that means a problem. That means our exports are becoming relatively cheap with less earnings receivable on those exported goods and services. Export price will be affected by the cost of raw materials and productivity. Relative inflation rates in different countries. We know if ever inflation increases, that might mean our exports will become relatively expensive, which will lead to the increase in terms of trade. However, we must also be aware that if ever inflation increases, it might also lead to the depreciation of the currency. So we must keep that in our mind also. High inflation will cause at least temporary improvement in terms of trade, as export prices will be rising faster than import prices caused by the inflation. However, inflation is likely to cause depreciation in the exchange rate, which cause export prices to fall. Yes, if ever inflation increases, that can cause depreciation, and as depreciation occurs, export prices will be declining, making our export becoming relatively cheap, which will be decreasing our terms of trade. The appreciation of the currency. The appreciation of the currency makes export more expensive and imports cheap. We know that if our currency appreciates against the US dollar will be depreciating. So that simply indicates that as our currency or South African rand appreciates, exports from South Africa will be selling at a relatively higher cost. So there will be more export earnings or more terms of trade. And then imports will be cheap. So the danger of having imports being cheap is the fact that local consumers might end up demanding most of imported goods and services and neglecting the locally produced goods and services because they will be cheap. These increase the terms of trade. So as the currency appreciates, that will be increasing terms of trade. Let's check the appreciation. So the currency appreciates, and then what will be happening? As the currency appreciates, the export prices will be increasing, and then terms of trade will also be increasing. That might only happen for the short run, remember, because if the currency appreciates, that means exports are becoming relatively expensive, so there will be more earnings on exports. However, if the goods that we are exporting to the foreign countries are easily replaceable, they're perfect substitute, they can be replaced if they become more expensive. That will lead to less demand for South African exports in foreign markets. Then how can we calculate terms of trade? So we say terms of trade equals to the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices multiplied by 100. So here we say index of average export prices divided by the index of average import prices multiplied by 100. That's how we calculate the terms of trade. So here we go. We have year number 1 here. It's a year, the index of export prices and the index of import prices. Then year number 1 here, export prices were 102, imports were 98. So if we can check here, if exports were expensive than the import, that means our terms of trade would be much better, would be high. Year number 2, export prices are declining from 102 to 94, while import prices are increasing to 100. So that seems to indicate the downward trend of terms of trade, they will be decreasing. Year number 3, export prices decline to 92, while import prices decline slightly to 99. This still indicates that export prices are still lower than import prices. This indicates the lower terms of trade. Year number 4, export prices increased to 105, while import prices increased to 104. This also indicates the positive trend of terms of trade, because if export prices are increasing faster than import prices, that means the increase in the terms of trade. So using the previous table, we say index of export prices divided by the index of import prices multiplied by 100. So that is 102 over 98 times 100, we get 104. Those are our terms of trade for year number 1. If we check year number 2, we keep the formula to say index of export prices divided by the index of imports multiplied by 100. Then we say export prices were 94, then over 100, which was the import prices multiplied by 100, we get 94. So that simply tells us that terms of trade are now declining because import prices increase faster than export prices. Year number 3, terms of trade, we keep the formula, we say then 92 over 99. So export prices were 92, while import prices were 99, multiplied by 100. This gives us what we call the 93. So they are still very low because imports are still expensive than exports. And then we check year number 4. We have the increase in export prices to 105, while the imports increase to 103. So we say export prices, which is 105, divided by import price, which is 103, multiplied by 100, we got 102 as terms of trade. This is how you simply calculate terms of trade if you are given an activity of this nature. It is very important that you manage and be able to calculate terms of trade, because they worth 4 marks if ever there are questions there for calculations. Also, it is very important for you to know the effect of the decrease or the effect of the increase in terms of trade. Remember, if ever terms of trade are increasing, there will be welfare gain, because more money will be earned by the country, which can be used to develop further infrastructure of the country or to create job opportunities. People will then be employed and earn more income. That will be indicating welfare gain. So as they increase terms of trade, that lead to more income received by South Africa. But if they decrease, that is bad for the country, because that seems to indicate that less income will be earned as payment for exports, and that will mean there will be a welfare loss due to the fact that people might find themselves being unemployed. What can cause them to be unemployed? If ever terms of trade are decreasing, that might be caused by depreciation of the currency. So as the currency depreciates, what is going to happen? Okay, I mean, as the currency depreciates, what is going to happen? They might be, our exports will be very, very cheap, so there will be less earnings received by exports. At the same time, imports will be expensive, which will be decreasing welfare from the population, because people will find imports becoming relatively expensive and not demanding more, so which will be taking away their welfare. That's why we say that's a welfare loss. So here we have calculated now. We have year index of export prices, index of imports, as well as terms of trade. So year number 1, 102 was export prices, 98 imports, terms of trade were equals to 104. And then year number 2, here we have 94 export prices, 100 import prices, and then we substituted, we got 94. So this indicates the downward trend of terms of trade. If ever they can ask you the trend here is downward, because terms of trade for the country are declining from 104 to 94. They decreased by 10%. And then we go further to year number 3. We have export prices being 92, imports being 99. If you can still check also, the export prices are lesser than import prices. That result to terms of trade declining also from 94 to 93. On the last one, what happens? The export prices jump quickly to 105, they increase. While import price increase also, but to 103. So in that case, if export prices are more than import price, terms of trade will be increasing. Hence, we see terms of trade slightly increasing from 93 to 102. This indicates that as export prices are becoming expensive, terms of trade are likely to increase. While if export prices are decreasing, terms of trade are likely to decrease. And then the next part here is the foreign exchange markets. In this case, we mainly focus on the exchange of world currencies across the world. We check the exchange rate, which is the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. So the main focus is on the currencies in there as we deal with the exchange rate. So the appreciation and the depreciation of the currency. How does the currency appreciate? How does the currency depreciate? How does the currency revaluate? How does the currency devaluate? So we have appreciation and devaluation. It is very important that we are able to give the difference between the two, because if we talk of the appreciation, we mean there are market forces that are involved in that. But if we talk of the revaluation, there are no market forces, but there's a direct control by the government authorities or the central bank. So the currency can appreciate or revaluate. And then what can cause appreciation of the currency? It will be caused by the excess supply. What is meant by the excess supply? Excess supply occurs when South African rand is highly supplied as it's being exchanged to other foreign countries. If our currency is oversupplied, that will result to the currency appreciating or becoming strong. But if our currency is highly demanded, that will lead to our currency losing the value or depreciating. So the appreciation is caused by excess supply. Depreciation is caused by excess demand. What about revaluation? Revaluation is all about the government intervening or central bank intervening to revalue the currency so that it can make exports relatively expensive. So in that case, there are no market forces that are involved, but there's a direct involvement or direct intervention by the authorities to influence the value of the currency. So this is all under foreign exchange market. So the exchange rate is the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. Here we compare different world currencies here. We can compare South African rand to the US dollar. We can compare US dollar to the rand. We can compare South African rand to British pound, etc. So exchange rate is the currency of one country compared or in comparison or in relation to another country's currency. Exchange rate determines the value of different world currencies. So if ever we deal with exchange rate, that's why we discover the value of different world currencies as they are compared to one another. World countries use different exchange rate systems, which include the free floating exchange rate, the managed or controlled floating exchange rate, as well as the fixed exchange rate. So in the world, countries that are using different world currencies. If we talk about the free floating exchange rate, we refer to the exchange rate that can appreciate and depreciate without limit. Its value is determined by market forces, demand and supply. The government does not intervene to influence the value of the currency in that case. That is the free floating exchange rate. Then we have the controlled or managed floating exchange rate. In that situation, you refer to the currency that can appreciate and depreciate, but within limits. There are some boundaries that have been set by the government so that the currency can only appreciate or depreciate within those boundaries. For instance, South African government can say South African rand can appreciate only up to 7 rand and then also depreciate only up to 12 rand. So that simply means the fluctuation or the floating ratio is from 7 to 12. The currency cannot appreciate below 7 rand to US dollar. It cannot appreciate above. It cannot appreciate below 7 rand, cannot depreciate above 12 rand. So it moves within limits. There are limitations that have been determined by the government or authorities based on the currency. So we call that one a floating controlled or a floating managed exchange rate, because it is controlled by the authorities to move within the boundaries instead of allowing it to move flexibly. So in that case, we say there are market forces are involved on the determination of what we call of the managed floating exchange rate or controlled floating exchange rate. However, not purely because the state intervened to set the minimum limit of fluctuation and the maximum limit of fluctuation, meaning it cannot jump beyond a certain number, cannot jump below a certain number. We call that what we call a controlled floating exchange rate. What does it mean by the floating? It means as it is floating, it can move in between boundaries. If this is maybe 7 rand and this is 12 rand, that means the currency can appreciate and depreciate between these numbers, cannot jump 12 rand, cannot jump 7 rand. Remember, when it appreciates, it moved from 12 to 7 rand. It has appreciated, it became strong. But when it depreciates, it's moved from 7 rand to 12 rand or any other higher number. That is known to be a depreciation. Each country is responsible for choosing the exchange rate system that suit its economic conditions. So each country in the world chooses its own exchange rate system that will be suiting its economy. For instance, South Africa is using the free floating exchange rate system because they feel like it's suitable for them. So hence I'm saying each country is responsible to make a choice of the exchange rate system that it can use. These are the exchange rate system, namely free floating exchange rate, the managed or controlled floating exchange rate, as well as the fixed exchange rate. So if we talk about the fixed exchange rate, we refer to the exchange rate system that remains constant for the given period of time. The value of this currency is determined by the government, not market forces. It remains fixed for the certain reason at a certain period of time. So that helps the country's currency not to create uncertainties because it remains constant for the given period of time. We call that one a fixed exchange rate. So the first one is the free floating exchange rate, which I said its value is determined by the market forces, demand and supply. So it is the system where the equilibrium exchange rate is determined by market forces, demand and supply without any intervention by the government. So this simply tells you that under free floating exchange rate, there is no government intervention. The government does not intervene to affect or to influence the value of the currency. However, market forces are free to determine the value of the currency. So we call that the free floating exchange rate. This exchange rate fluctuates as market conditions change. So if ever market conditions are changing, the exchange rate will also be fluctuating, can either appreciate or depreciate. This system generally works automatically. So it does not have to be controlled by anyone, but it works automatically to whoever that is willing to make use of it. Disequilibrium are automatically corrected. With the disequilibrium that is happening in the market, they are automatically corrected if ever the country is using the free floating exchange rate. Central banks have little control over it, and as a result, they prefer not to interfere. So central banks decide not to interfere on the determination of the free floating exchange rate. In that case, so market forces are truly responsible to move exchange rate system up or down or appreciate or depreciate. South Africa has had the free floating exchange rate since year 2002. So the country chose to adopt the free floating exchange rate since year 2002 from the controlled or managed floating exchange rate. And then we talk about the managed floating or controlled exchange rate. So the value of the exchange rate may respond to the influences of market forces within the certain predetermined limit. So that's when the state intervened by predetermining some limit of the exchange rate. So it can maybe say the rand to the dollar can appreciate up to 7 rand, can depreciate up to 12 rand, nothing above 12, nothing below 7. In that case, that means the currency can appreciate and depreciate, but within limits. It is controlled, it is managed. Its fluctuation is not free like the free floating, but it moves within the predetermined limits that have been determined or set by the authorities to ensure that the currency can indeed appreciate, but to the certain extent, can indeed depreciate to the certain extent. Before these limits are reached, the monetary authority intervenes by buying or selling foreign exchange, thus influencing the demand or the supply of the foreign currency. So the authorities are responsible also to hold on the foreign currency so that they can be able to control the fluctuation of the currency. Big supplies of forex are needed for such intervention. So for this intervention to happen, there must be the big supply of the foreign exchange markets. Remember, if ever the currency is oversupplied, that leads to the currency becoming even stronger or appreciating. But if it's over demanded, that means the currency will be losing its value. It will then depreciate. Intervention will result to appreciation or depreciation of the currency. It depends. For example, central bank can increase supply of domestic currency by buying other currencies. Because of increased supply, the price of the domestic currency will decrease. From 1979 to year 2002, South Africa used the managed floating exchange rate system. So from 1979 to year 2002, South Africa was using the managed or controlled floating exchange rate, but now it is using the free floating exchange rate system. Then let's talk about the fixed exchange rate. So the fixed exchange rate means that the value of the currency is fixed or pegged at a certain level by the state. So if it's pegged, that means it remains constant for the given period of time. It cannot appreciate, cannot depreciate. It remains constant. That currency is fixed or pegged. Until 1971, the value of such currencies was fixed in terms of the amount of gold backing the standard of money. So back then, until 1971, the value of the rand was backed by the gold. So that mean it was fixed using the monetized currency. So the monetized gold. So what did they do? They monetize the gold or demonetize the gold. If they monetize the gold, they give the gold the monetary value from the mining, and they scale it in there to discover the value. Or if they demonetize, they take the gold away from the scale so that it loses monetary value. Since then, their values has been fixed in terms of US dollar. Examples are China and Saudi Arabia. The central bank must buy or sell currency to maintain the exchange rate at the set level. So to ensure that the currency does not appreciate and depreciate, remains at the set level, it is responsible, or the central bank is fully responsible to do what? To buy or sell the currency. We continue with the fixed exchange rate. In order to avoid the uncertainties of the continuously changing exchange rates, government usually peg their rates and at undervalued levels and avoid running out of foreign exchange reserve. So now we are talking about the undervalued. If ever the currency is undervalued, that means the currency maybe should be costing 6 rand equals to 1 US dollar, but it is costing 12 rand equals to 1 US dollar. That currency is undervalued. It should be stronger than that, but it is undervalued. When reserves become low, they devalue their currency. When reserves become too high and cause inflation, they revalue their currency. Government can devaluate the exchange rate by fixing it at the lower level, or revaluate the exchange rate by fixing it at the higher level. So you can note that if we talk about devaluation, we refer to the state intervention. If we talk about revaluation, we refer to the state intervention. There are no market forces, but it is controlled manually. Before 1979, South Africa used the fixed exchange rate system. So before the year 1979, South Africa was using the fixed exchange rate system, meaning it was using exchange rate system that cannot appreciate and depreciate. It remains constant for the given period of time. So now let's check appreciation. So if we talk about appreciation, we talk about the strengthen the currency or the strong currency. If the currency is appreciating, it becomes relatively strong compared to another currency. For instance, if our South African rand is appreciating against the US dollar will be depreciating. So it is very important for you to know that this move happens simultaneously, but they cannot both appreciate. If the rand appreciates against the dollar will be depreciating against the rand in that case. If two currencies are compared, the appreciation of one currency means the depreciation of another currency, like I've mentioned before. If we compare two currencies, if one currency appreciates against another one, that other one is depreciating. In comparison, as one currency gains the strength, the alternating currency is losing the strength. They can't be gaining the strength at the same time, both of them. If one is gaining the strength, one is losing the strength. Remember, we say if the currency appreciates, we mean it is strengthened, it is strong. Appreciation of the currency is good. For exports and bad for imports. So it is very much good for export. Why? Because our export will be very much competitive abroad. They will be relatively expensive, which will be earning the country high level of terms of trade. However, it is bad for imports because importers will be receiving less amount of money as they import their goods and services due to the fact that these goods will be relatively cheap, even though local consumers might be demanding more of them. Consumers might be demanding imports because they will be cheap. However, local consumers will demand, as they demand, firms that were that imported those goods will receive less revenues as payment for imports due to the fact that maybe they spend a lot of money producing those imports, but now because of the weak currency, they find themselves having to sell them at the lower cost in the foreign country due to the depreciation of the currency. Appreciation is caused by excess supply. So if ever we have an excess supply, or maybe the rand is oversupplied, that will mean we will be facing appreciation and the decline in the demand of the currency in the foreign exchange market. If ever the South African rand is not highly demanded abroad, then the supply is too high than the demand, our currency will be appreciating or gaining the strength. However, if our currency is highly demanded abroad while we are supplying less of it in South Africa and across the world, that will mean our currency will be depreciating. What are the effects of appreciating or of appreciation? If the currency is gaining the strength or appreciate, what is going to happen? Exports will be becoming expensive, so they will be becoming competitive in the foreign market. So if exports are becoming expensive, that means there will be more income earned as a payment for exports. If there is more income earned as a payment for exports, that simply tells us that there will be more money flowing into the country, which will be increasing terms of trade, and there will be a welfare gain because the income received as a payment for exports can be used to further objectives of the country, such as achieving full employment, achieving economic growth, ensuring price stability, and then ensuring economic equity, etc. Expensive export has a short-run effect on increasing export earnings. Yes, like I mentioned before, if ever they become expensive, they might be consumed in the short run due to the fact that these goods are expensive. So if they become expensive, those foreign consumers might look for alternative products to replace our exports that are relatively expensive in their economies. So that is bad in that case, if they're expensive. That's why we say there is only a benefit for the short run, whereby we will be earning high terms of trade, but in the future, there might be a decline in terms of trade if if our currency or our export prices are decreasing. If our export prices remains high, as export prices are relatively high, our goods will be expensive abroad and there will be lower demand for them. If there's a lower demand for them in the long run, that means less income will be earned as the payment for exports. These increased terms of trade and welfare gain for the country in the short run. So with the export prices increasing, terms of trade will be increasing because there will be more earnings received by South Africa as payment for exports. That will only happen for the short run, only if those goods are relatively elastic or they are easily replaceable. The long run effect of appreciation is the decrease in the demand for export, depending on the price elasticity of demand for the exported goods and services. If goods that were exported are relatively elastic, that will mean that they are easily replaceable. So that will indicate to us that as those goods are becoming expensive, foreign consumers will be compromising them by demanding other goods and services. So that will be leading to the decrease in terms of trade in the long run. However, in the short run, we have a huge benefit because terms of trade will be increasing due to the fact that our currency has appreciated and export prices has also increased. We continue with the effect of appreciation. This can result to the decrease in production of goods and services locally and decrease the country's GDP. If ever the currency is appreciating, exports become expensive. If exports are becoming expensive, there might be a decrease in foreign demand. As the foreign demand is decreasing, that will be discouraging local firms to produce even more goods because there's a lower demand internationally. And that will lead to a problem in the country because people might be losing their jobs since export markets are no longer demanding our exported goods and services. And that will be bad for the economy because the country's production will decrease, GDP of the country will be decreasing, and economic growth will also be decreasing because of the decrease in production for goods and services due to the fact that they are not highly demanded abroad since export prices have increased. Appreciation has an effect of increasing the trade deficit and stretches current account deficit because imports become cheaper as exports become expensive. Look, if ever the currency appreciates, that is not good for BOP because if the currency appreciates, that means our exports will be expensive than imports. As exports become relatively expensive, they won't be highly demanded. So if we check the trade balance on the current account, it will be affected negatively because imports might be increasing faster than exports. If that is happening, that will mean there will be more money flowing out to pay for imports and less money coming in as a payment for exports. So in that case, appreciation is bad, because if the currency appreciates, it becomes stronger. The export prices will be increasing, they will be expensive. And then import prices will be decreasing, because if our currency is appreciating against the foreign currency is depreciating against the South African rand. So their imports will be cheap while our exports are expensive. So local consumers can simply compromise our locally produced goods by demanding the cheap imports, which is bad for BOP, because we might find that imports are increasing at a faster rate than the export level, which will cause the trade deficit and the current account deficit. This benefits local consumers as they can get to choose from the range of imports at the lower cost, while compromising the locally produced goods and services. Like I've mentioned before, if ever exports are becoming relatively expensive, local consumers find an opportunity to demand cheap imports, because as exports are becoming expensive, imports will be cheap, because that is caused by appreciation of rand and depreciation of that other alternating currency. If our currency appreciates, export will be expensive with more foreign earnings. However, they won't be highly demanded if ever those goods are faced by elastic demand. So in that case, we will have a problem as a country, because imports will be increasing more than exports. What will be causing imports to increase? It is the fact that as our currency appreciates, their currency depreciates. If their currency depreciates, imports will become relatively cheap in South Africa, causing local consumers to demand most of imported goods by compromising the locally produced goods and services. That is bad for the economy. However, it's good for terms of trade. In this, if this is persistent, local firms might be more vulnerable, which can shut down local markets. So if ever the situation of having our currency appreciating drastically, and then that will lead to imports becoming relatively cheap, high demand for imports will be happening, and that will be resulting to local firms becoming vulnerable. Why vulnerable? They will be becoming vulnerable because there is less demand on our goods that are produced, but there will be more demand on imported goods, because imports will be becoming relatively cheap for South Africans, while exports will be expensive. So that leads to local consumers demanding most of cheap imports to compromise the locally produced goods and services, which is bad for our BOP, because imports will find themselves increasing at a faster rate than the exports. So this is the graph that indicates appreciation of the currency. Let's check. There must be excess supply. So in this case, we have the original supply curve, original demand curve. And then all original points, we have we have 15 rand as what we call as a rand to the dollar. And then the quantity is the quantity supplied and demanded on the equilibrium point in there. So as the supply of South African rands increase, so why should we supply our rands? We are supplying our rands because maybe we want to pay for imported goods and services, we want to invest abroad, or we want to pay some dividends on those foreign investors that have invested on shares. So that means we'll be supplying most of our rand. As the rand is highly supplied, the rand, the supply for rand will be shifting from left to the right. So we see now we have S1 indicating that the supply for the rand has increased. But now the demand for rand is remain unchanged. It is not responsive to the change in supply, and that is causing an effect of appreciation of the currency. Our currency become relatively strong now, because we're paying 15 rand per single US dollar, but now we are paying 12 rand per single US dollar. That means now if our currency is appreciating, we can afford more of the foreign currencies at the lower cost than before, because whenever it appreciates, it becomes relatively good for us to afford most of the foreign currencies. So do not be confused. When we are dealing with this thing of appreciation and depreciation, we use indirect approach, not a direct approach. Appreciation should not be the increase in numerical values. It should be the decrease in numerical values. So we're paying 15 rand per single US dollar, but now we're paying 12 rand per single US dollar. That means we can afford more of dollars now than before, because our rand has appreciated while the dollar has depreciated. So what has happened? Whenever the supply increases from S to S1, what is created? A new equilibrium point is created there at E1. So we have the rand value appreciating from 15 to 12. So, and then we have the new equilibrium there, and then we have the new quantity, which is Q1, meaning now we can afford most of US dollars using 12 rand than before when we were spending only 15 rand. So this is indicating the excess supply because the rand is oversupplied than the demanded. So there is more supply. If you see S1 without seeing a D1, in this case, showing the increase in the supply, that simply tells you that the rand is oversupplied. There's an excess supply. There's an oversupply of South African rand in the foreign exchange markets, which is leading to the rand becoming stronger because it is oversupplied. So there is no responsiveness of demand in this case. So the same graph comes back. Original points, S is the original supply curve, and then D is original demand curve. And then E is original supply curve, and then we have Q, which is original quantity supplied and demanded, and then we also have 15 rand to 1 US dollar, which is Q. The supply of rand increased from S to S1. We are seeing here the supply of rand is increasing from S to S1. This indicates the increase of the supply for the rand, while the demand remains unchanged. So the supply of rand increased from S to S1, while the demand remains constant or unchanged. You can see that the demand is not responsive. It remains at D, while the supply is increasing to S1. That simply indicates that the quantity demanded remains the same at Q, but the quantity supplied is now at Q1. If these were numbers, it was going maybe to be 4 and 10. So we initially supplied 4 South African rand, and then but at the later stage we supplied 10 while the demand remains at 4. So the rand is oversupplied in the market or in the foreign exchange market, which results to the currency gaining the strength or appreciating. The quantity of rand supplied increased to Q1. You see is Q1 now here, while the value of the rand appreciates from 15 to 12. Don't be confused by opposite numbers. These indicate appreciation of the currency. To prove that, you can simply say 12,000 divided by 15 rand. See, if ever we have 12,000, how much of US dollars can we get or can we access if we pay 15 rand? It will be less than when we pay only 12 rand. So in this case, 12 rand is much better because we can afford most of US dollars than before. So this is indicating appreciation. Don't be confused by opposite numbers. If ever the rand was costing 16 rand 90 is to 1 US dollar, but later it's costing 7 rand is to 1 US dollar, that means appreciation because South Africans will be affording most of US dollars at the lower cost at 7 rand per single dollar, which is good for the economy. Excess supply of rand occurs. So here is the excess supply indicated by this area, which is indicated here as the what you call the triangle. So this is indicating excess supply. The rand is oversupplied in the market, which is giving it the strength. And then now let's check. This is still the appreciation. However, there is a change in demand. So the demand is changing now. How is it changing? It is not increasing like before, but the demand is decreasing. Let's check. Original points, we have D, we have S, and then we have E as original equilibrium, with the quantity being Q, and the rand is equals to 18 rand equals to 1 US dollars in there. That is Q indicating. And then if ever the demand for rand is decreasing. So how much of the quantity of rand is being supplied? Maybe we're supplying about 100 units here of the South African rand. And then the demand for rand decreases from 100 maybe to 50. How much is the supply? The supply remains at 100, but the demand is now 50. The demand is decreasing, but the supply remains high. If you can check, the supply is not responsive here to the change in demand. The supply did not decrease with the decrease in demand. It remains high at 100 units, but the quantity, the demand for for South African rands is decreasing now from 100 to 50 units. What happens then? That is leading to the currency appreciating. Our rand is becoming even strong because there is an excess supply. The rand remain being oversupplied in this position here, but the quantity demanded, the demand is decreasing, but the supply remains high. So this gives an advantage to the rand to appreciate. That's why the rand appreciates from 18 rand to 11 rand. Why this? This happens, this is called appreciation because When we had 18, when we were paying 18 rand per single dollar, we were paying a lot of money. The dollar was expensive. But if it's costing 11 rand, it becomes relatively cheap for us as South Africans. So we can easily tour to US because now we are affording most of their currency at the lower cost, because now it's cheap if it's costing about 11 rand than when it was costing 18 rand per single US dollar. So we call this one an appreciation also. It is caused by excess supply. The excess supply is not caused by the increase in supply. The supply remains constant at 100 units here on the original supply curve. However, the demand is decreasing to D1. That simply means as the demand decreases from 100 to 50, the supply remains high. In that case, the currency will be appreciating or becoming stronger. So this is the graph explanation. At the original point, S is the original supply curve, while D is the original demand curve. E is original supply curve. You can see E there being original supply curve. Original equilibrium. 18 is the original value of the rand against US dollar. Here is original value of the rand. And then the quantity demanded and supplied in there is Q. That these are the original points. Then the demand for rands decreases. You see, if the demand for rand is decreasing, it moves from D to D1. But how about the supply? It remains constant or unchanged at 100 units. This one decreased to 50. So the rand, the Q is the, okay, we continue. The rand for, the demand for rand decreased from D to D1 while the supply remains unchanged. You can see the supply remains at S, so it remains high. This quantity supplied remains at Q, which is 100 units, but demanded decreased from 100 to 50, which is now Q1. This tells us that there is an excess supply. There is more supply of rand than the demand. The demand for South African rand. Quantity of rand demanded decreased from Q to Q1, while the value of rand appreciates from 18 to 11 rand. So our rand is gaining the strength or gaining the value. Now we can only pay 11 rands to afford a single US dollar than before. Before we were paying 18 rands, but now we're paying only 11 rands. We call this appreciation. Our rand is becoming stronger. We can afford most of the US dollars with the 11 rand because our currency has appreciated. It is very important for you to know that if we talk of the appreciation, we are not using the direct approach, we use indirect approach. Appreciation will be then when the numerical value for our currency compared to the foreign currency declines. We have to pay less amount of money to afford the foreign currency. If you can check again, initially we're paying 18 rand was equals to 1 US dollar. But now we say 11 rand equals to 1 US dollar. So check this thing. It is the advantage to us as South Africans because the dollar was very expensive for us there. If we wanted to buy goods from US, we had to pay a lot of money. We want to import machines and equipment, it becomes relatively expensive because our rand is weak. But if our rand is becoming 11 rand equal to 1 US dollar, that means this is our advantage as South Africans due to the fact that we will be paying less amount of money to afford those machines and equipment abroad. We will be paying less amount of money to afford US dollars so that we can be involved in international tourism. Excess supply of rand will occur. So we see it happening here in this distance. This is indicating the excess supply of rand because the rand remains at 100, but the quantity demanded it goes down to 50. So there's a difference of 50 in there. So the rand is highly supplied. There's an excess supply of rand that is causing appreciation of South African rand. Remember, if ever the rand appreciates, that's an advantage to local consumers to afford most of imported goods and services because as the rand appreciates against the dollar will be depreciating. That will mean if the goods that are imported from US will be cheap in South Africa. And then also we will be able to afford most of foreign, US dollars as South Africans because of the strong South African rand. Firms can be able to import machines and equipment as well as technology abroad from US so that they can keep up with their production. However, this is bad for the balance of payment because as our currency appreciates, our exports will become relatively expensive. As exports are becoming relatively expensive, there will be lower demand for South African exported goods and services in the foreign market. And as there's a lower demand, there's a high demand for imports in South Africa because as our currency appreciates, their currency depreciates. That simply indicates that their imports are becoming relatively cheap for us as South Africans, which will lead to the social welfare gain, while for the BOP and the economy, imports won't be highly demanded because they will be expensive, which will be compromising our exports. So we might come across a situation whereby imports are increasing faster than exports, which will be causing the trade deficit or even the current account deficit. Then let's move to the revaluation. Remember, appreciation was caused by the effect of market forces, demand and supply. Revaluation, we say, is a direct intervention or deliberate intervention by the central bank to positively influence the currency of the country to make exports expensive. So when the government or the Reserve Bank intervene directly or purposefully or deliberately to influence the value of the currency, to increase the value of the currency, we call that revaluation. It revalues the currency. It makes it stronger so that our exports can become expensive in the global market to increase even in terms of trade. This is done as a mechanism to increase export earnings and welfare gain. So if ever our rand has been revaluated by the central bank, remember we call that a direct intervention. That will lead to our exports becoming relatively expensive in the foreign market. As they become expensive, there might be more foreign earnings and increased terms of trade. However, we know the story. As they become expensive, if ever they are relatively elastic, that can lead to them not being highly demanded. They can easily be replaced because there will be available alternative products to replace those those exported goods and services by South Africa. Depreciated local currency makes export to be cheap and result to them selling below the production cost. Revaluation gives a value of on the local currency while making imports more expensive. So if ever our currency gains the value, that will mean our exports will be cheap, will be expensive abroad, and then that will mean we'll be earning most of export earnings from the global market, which will be giving us more what we call welfare gain as for the economic welfare will be improving because of what? Because of our exports are relatively expensive, there will be more earnings. We know the story of terms of trade, they will be increasing in the short run provided of those goods are elastic or inelastic. Then let's check the depreciation and the devaluation. It is very important for you to know that this revaluation we're talking about is not influenced by market forces, but is a direct control. But appreciation is influenced by market forces, demand and supply. So depreciation. Remember, if we talk about depreciation, we refer to the situation whereby the country's currency is losing the strength against the foreign currency. So for the currency to depreciate, there must be excess demand. It must be highly demanded. Then devaluation is a deliberate move by central bank to decrease the value of the currency. So we'll talk about that soon. So let's check here on the depreciation. So we say depreciation weakens the value of the currency as compared to what we call the alternating currency. Whenever the currency is losing the value, we say that's a depreciation if it's caused by market forces, mainly demand and supply. If two currencies are compared, the appreciation of one currency means depreciation of another currency, like I've mentioned before. They don't appreciate simultaneously. As one appreciate, one depreciate. In comparison, as one currency gains the strength, the alternating currency is losing the strength. Depreciation of the currency is bad for export and good for import. Let's check. We say depreciation is bad for exports. Why? Our exports become less competitive abroad because they become relatively cheap. Remember, what's the problem here? If our exports are becoming relatively cheap, it can happen that the cost of production was relatively high in South Africa to produce those goods to be exported. However, because of the weak currency, they become cheap abroad. So that would be resulting to the country not receiving more money and also there might be even a loss in this case because exports were produced at the higher cost, but they are now sold at the lower cost because of the weak currency. So it is bad. The depreciation is bad for us as South Africans because our goods become relatively cheap abroad. That compromises local firms that have been exporting goods. They get less returns, which can even be lower than the cost of production. So as for imports, it is good for imports because if our currency depreciates, that means our goods then will become expensive while their goods will be affordable. So let's check. Depreciation is caused by excess demand. So for the currency to depreciate, there must be high demand for our currency. So the demand for our currency must be more than the supply of the currency. We call that excess demand. Remember, when we spoke about excess supply, our rand was highly supplied than demanded. But in this case, it's opposite. Our rand is highly demanded than supplied. There's a high level of demand than the level of supply. So the demand is increasing faster than the supply of the currency. That is causing the currency to depreciate. What is the effect of depreciation? As the currency depreciates, exports become cheap or less competitive in the foreign markets. Our export will be relatively cheap in foreign markets because our currency has depreciated or lost the value. So there will be less foreign earnings. Cheap imports has a short-run effect on increasing, on increasing import earnings. This decreases the terms of trade and welfare gain of the country. So there will be less terms of trade because our goods are becoming relatively cheap abroad. The long run effect of the depreciation is the decrease in demand for imports, depending on the elasticity of demand for imported goods and services. So if ever the imported goods are easily replaceable, that will mean local consumers will decide to demand other goods and services than demanding expensive imports. If those imports are expensive because of our rand has lost the value, their currency has gained the strength. Their imports will be expensive. Local consumers can only demand those imports in the short run. In the long run, they won't be demanding them. They will be seeking for substitute goods for those imported goods and services. But if those goods are not having any substitutes, then local consumers might keep on demanding those goods that are imported, which are relatively expensive, which will be keeping their terms of trade relatively high. However, if imported goods are easily replaceable with their perfect substitutes, that will simply indicate that those imports then can be replaced, and that will be decreasing their terms of trade. So that's why I'm saying here, this depreciation is good for importers in the short run, but in the long run, it might be bad if ever those imports are having what we call their demand is relatively elastic because it can easily be replaced. So this graph is indicating what we call the depreciation. So I want you to indicate or to see the depreciation and also the excess demand. So in this case, we'll see the demand increasing faster than the supply of the rand. We have original demand curve, which is 80, original supply, which is S in there. And then as they meet there, we have original equilibrium, which is E. The quantity supplied and demanded is equal there at Q. And then the value of rand is how much is 10 rand equals to $1 at Q there. So here we are paying 10 rand to afford a single US dollar. However, with the increase in the demand for South African rands, it increases, that pushes the demand to the right from D to D1. This is D1 now, indicated by an arrow increasing in there. As the demand for rand is increasing more than the supply of rand, that means now foreigners or foreign business or individuals are demanding most of the rand, and the rand is not highly supplied. That is resulting to the increase in the quantity of rand demanded from Q to Q1. As the quantity of rand demanded increased from Q to Q1, the quantity of rand supplied remained constant at Q. That means maybe this is 100 and this is 300. So the quantity demanded is increased from 100 to 200, but the quantity supplied remained at 100, does not change. Why I'm saying is it is not changing, because if you can check the supply, it did not respond to the change in the demand for South African rand. It remained constant, meaning the quantity supplied remained at 100, but the quantity demanded increased to 300 units. In that case, that pushes the price up there. That means our currency is now depreciating. It loses the value from 10 rand to 17 rand. That simply tells you that initially we're paying 10 rand to afford a single US dollar. But now we are paying 17 rand to afford a single US dollar. That simply tells you that the dollar is becoming relatively expensive for us as South Africans. That is known as depreciation for us. Our rand is depreciating because we need to pay a lot of money to afford a single dollar. Importers or businesses can find it difficult to afford machinery and equipment abroad from US because of the expensive currency now. And then with that happening now, that simply means that our currency is losing the value. What is going to happen now in our exports? Our export will become relatively cheap abroad because the value of the rand has dropped. So if they become cheap, if our export become cheap, they might be highly demanded abroad, which will lead to our export increasing faster than imports. So export might be increasing faster than imports because they are cheap in the foreign market. However, that is bad for local businesses, because as these goods are becoming cheap, it might happen that the cost of production was higher than the selling price now. That is caused by the weak currency. So it is bad for our business because it will be decreasing their earnings as they export their goods and services abroad. However, it is good for BOP because as the BOP happens there, that can lead to what? There will be high demand for export and lower demand for import. So exports will be increasing faster than imports. However, the inflows might be decreasing in that case if ever our currency is relatively low, it's weak. So the inflows in that BOP might be lower than the outflows because our currency will be relatively weak compared to the US dollar. So we call this excess demand. This what we call triangle here indicates the excess demand, meaning our rand is highly demanded than being supplied. It is very important for you to know that at Q, the demand and supply were equal. We were demanding what we call 100 units, and then the supplied was also 100 units. However, now the demand for rand increases now to 300 units, while the supply remains at 100. That is pushing prices up. So that is resulting to the value of the currency losing its strength or the currency depreciating. Now we must pay more to afford the US dollar. We are now paying 17 rand than when we were paying only 10 rand. Our currency is weak. It has depreciated, and that is bad for our economy. So the graph is being explained here. So original points, S is original supply curve, D original demand curve, and E is original equilibrium. And then 10 rand is originally the value of rent. And then we have Q, which is, okay, here is 3. 3 is the original quantity demanded. So the demand for the rand increases from D to D1. We see the demand increasing to D1. Does the supply respond? No, it does not respond. If the supply was responding, it was going to shift from S to S1. However, there is no that response of the increase of the supply. It remains constant there. That means the quantity supplied remains at 3, but the quantity demanded is how much? Is 6. That simply means now there's excess demand. The rand is over demanded within the foreign markets, which resulting to the rand losing the strength. Now the rand is costing 17 rand. The rand is costing about 17 rand to afford the dollar, but before it was only costing about 10 rand. So we call this what we call a depreciation. It is caused by the increase in the demand for the rand while the supply remains constant. The quantity of rand demanded increased to quantity 6 or to 6. We see this is 6, and then while the value of rand depreciates from 10 to 17 rand, you see it is depreciating from 10 to 17 rand. This is depreciation because the rand is losing the strength. We can now afford less US dollars. If we cannot use numbers here, use Q and Q1. That simply means now to afford a single dollar, before we're paying about 10 rand, but now we're paying about how much? 17 rand to afford a single dollar, and that is bad for us because the dollar becomes relatively expensive. Then that simply indicates that local firms will find it expensive to import machines and equipment. That means local consumers will find it expensive to import goods and services, which will be leading to welfare loss because now imports will be becoming relatively expensive for South African citizens. We continue with the depreciation. It is still the excess demand. How now? There must be a decrease in the supply while the demand remains constant. Let's check. The original demand curve is D. Supply is also S. Equilibrium is E there. We are paying 13 rand to afford a single US dollar. So let's check now. This is Q. At Q, to afford a dollar, we pay 13 rand. So let's check now. The what you call this indicate that the dollar is relatively cheap, this 13 rand. But if ever the supply for South African rand is declining from S to S1, you can see it's shifting from S to S1, while the demand remains high at Q. So the quantity demanded remains at 100, but the quantity supplied now declines to 50. What is happening now? The supply is lower than the demand. That means the demand remains higher than the quantity supplied. And that is resulting to what? It is resulting to our currency losing its value or losing the strength. This is what we call a depreciation. The currency is losing the value from 13 to 16 rand. So we have to pay more rand to afford a single US dollar. 16 rand is too much to pay for a single US dollar than before when we were paying 13 rand. So this is excess demand because the quantity of rand demanded remains higher than the quantity of rand supply. That's why we say depreciation is caused by excess demand. The demand of the currency must be more than the supply of the currency. Then originally, what we call supply is S, the demand is D, and then original equilibrium is E in there. And then 13 rand is the original value of rand against US dollar. So let's check. The supply of rands decreased from S to S1. It has declined from S to S1, meaning now less rands will be made available in supply, but the demand for rands remains high. And the demand for rand remains unchanged, which is very, very high at 10 in there. And then quantity of rand supply decreased from to 6, while the value of rand depreciates from 13 to 16 rand. So the rand is depreciating now because initially we were paying 13 rand to afford a dollar, but now we're paying 16 rand to afford a dollar. That is too expensive. Then excess demand for rand. Okay, so the rand is highly demanded in the market than what is being supplied. So that is bad in the economy. So let's talk about devaluation now, which is affected by the deliberate intervention by the central bank. So the devaluation is the direct intervention by the central bank to negatively influence the currency of the country to make exports cheap. So for the government to make export cheap, it will be devaluating so that the quantity or the volume of exports can increase. They have to be relatively cheap so that there will be more demand for our exports in the foreign market to improve our POP. This is done as a mechanism to increase the demand for export to positively influence the balance of payments. Appreciated local currency make export expensive and result to decline in the demand. And then we continue effects of undervalued or overvalued currency. So if the currency is overvalued, that means the currency is costing more than it should be. The currency is too expensive. I mean, the currency is too strong than it should be. That means, let's say the rand is about 7 rand equals to 1 US dollar, instead of being 12 rand equals to 1 US dollar. So our currency is too strong in this case. We say it's overvalued. Remember, overvalued currency can be good, can also be bad, because if it's overvalued, export won't be highly demanded abroad. That will be bad for the currency. It is important for the currency not to be overvalued in order to increase the volume of exports. Overvalued currency decrease the demand for South African exports in global or foreign markets. This decrease the local productivity, decrease employment, and also decrease GDP as well as economic growth of the country. Foreign earnings on assets will be increasing, however, because our currency will be too strong or overvalued. Earnings on liabilities will be decreasing because their currency will be undervalued while our currency is overvalued. Correcting the overvalued currency. South African Reserve Bank increased interest rate to attract more foreign investments. Remember, if ever the Reserve Bank increase interest rates, that will result to those investors that are investing in South Africa from abroad on portfolio investment and a financial account, they will be attracted to invest the most because now they will be earning more returns on their investment as they purchase shares. So interest rate will be increased. The R stand for interest rate. Then the foreign investment on shares will be increasing. So there will be excess demand for South African rand. So there will be more demand for South African rand. And then what will happen? Supply for the rand remain unchanged. It will remain lower, but the demand will be highly demanded. The rand will be highly demanded, which will be causing our currency to depreciate. So the central bank can intervene by increasing interest rate to correct the overvalued currency so that there will be more demand for South African rand. If there is more demand for the South African rand by investors on portfolio or on shares, that will lead to excess demand. The demand will be more than the supply, which will be resulting to the currency depreciating. So South African Reserve Bank can directly intervene through devaluation demand for exports will be increasing in that case. South African Reserve Bank can relax exchange rate control. The demand for South African rand can also increase. If the South African Reserve Bank relax exchange rate control, or those policies will be relaxed, making it easy for foreign people to access our rand, then the demand for the rand will be increasing in foreign markets. Government decreases import restriction. The government can intervene by reducing, withdrawing import restriction to make imports to overflow in South African economy. The demand for South African rand will be increasing by importers, and then the demand for rand will be exceeding the supply. So this will be leading to the demand increasing more than the supply of rand. That's when the currency is overvalued. Benefits of the stable currency. If the currency is stable, it creates a greater environment for domestic exporters, and then also stimulate capital formation by local industries. If ever our currency is stable, we can be able to really increase capital formation by buying more machines abroad, because our currency will be mostly stable against other currencies. Increase foreign earnings on domestic investment. As we invest abroad, we'll be earning reasonable earnings abroad, or revenues. Decrease in cost push inflation, because machines now won't be highly expensive due to the currency won't be that weak, but it will be stable. Increase in local investment into the foreign market. It will be easy for local investors to invest abroad because the currency will be stable. It won't be highly expensive for South Africans to invest in the foreign countries. And then this part is for assessments. So here we are given the graph as a part of the data response. The price of US dollars in rands. So there's a supply, and then you can see here there's an increase in the demand from Q1 to Q2, and then you can see that there's a movement from 13 to 14 in there. So let's check questions quickly. So identify exchange rate system depicted on the graph above. What was the original demand? Original rand to dollar exchange rate before the demand for US dollars increased? Briefly describe the term exchange rate. How has the increase in the demand for US dollars affected the value of rand? What could the Reserve Bank do to strengthen the value of the rand against the US dollar? So the question there, and then free floating exchange rate is used in there. What was the original rand dollar exchange rate before the demand for dollar increased? It was 13 rand is to $1 US. And then briefly describe the term exchange rate. Exchange rate is the currency of one country in relation to another country's currency. So the rate at which one currency is exchanged to another, or the value of one country's currency in terms of another country's currency. How has the increase in demand for US dollars affected the value of rand? The value of rand depreciated from 13 rand to 14 rand against the US dollar. Against the dollar, depreciated by 1 rand, has weakened. What could Reserve Bank do to strengthen the value of the rand against the dollar? The Reserve Bank could strengthen by selling US dollars in the reserve in the foreign exchange market to create oversupply, selling gold reserve on the international market to create an oversupply. What could Reserve Bank do? We continue obtaining assistance on financial support from the International Monetary Fund to increase the inflow of foreign exchange, increasing the repo rate to stimulate investment by foreigners in the South African economy. A second data response on the graph. Again, we are given the graph in there that is indicating the change in the supply from S to S1, S2, with the demand remaining unchanged. You can see we have original equilibrium E1 and E2, and then the value of rand there we have 10 rand, 11 rand, and 12 rand. So the quantity was 30, 40, and 50. Let's look at the questions in there. Which supply curve indicate the decrease in the supply of dollars? It's S2, S2. What type of the exchange rate system is currently used in South Africa? In South Africa, we use the free floating exchange rate. Briefly describe the concept devaluation. Devaluation is the deliberate decrease in the value of the currency by the central bank. And then state one fact that could have led to the increase in the supply of dollars. Why should they be supplying US dollars? Increase in the number of US tourists visiting South Africa. Increase in the foreign direct investment from US. How can the weak South African rand affect terms of trade? Depreciated South African rand makes South African export more affordable in the foreign markets, which increase the demand. The decrease in export prices lowers terms of trade, resulting to less export earnings. And then here we have terms of trade from 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. So we have index of export prices, index of imports, terms of trade. So we have 141 to 171, which indicate a lower terms of trade for the country. and then we have 153 to 191 import price. Export prices remain high. So they are this side. Imports are 141, exports are 171, imports are 153, exports are 191, imports are 163, exports are 200, imports are 179, exports are 214. That means exports remains high in terms of prices. That is increasing our terms of trade. And then the source is South African Reserve Bank. Let's look at the question. Which institution is responsible to publish the above data? Is South African Reserve Bank. What is the trend of import prices? It is the increasing trend, even though it is not increasing further than the export prices. Briefly describe the term terms of trade. Terms of trade is the index or the ratio of export prices in relation to import prices. What impact will the increase in terms of trade have on South African welfare? The increase in terms of trade will result to the increase in the country's foreign earnings, which can increase national income. The increase in national income increases country's social and economic welfare, since money can be used to improve economic and social infrastructure and increase employment opportunities. Calculate terms of trade for 2019. Show all calculations. So terms of trade equal to the index of export prices over the index of import multiplied by 100. Then export price were 191 over 153 multiplied by 100, which give us 124.8 or 125. That give you the 4 marks. That's how you calculate the terms of trade. We are given the graph again here on the data response. Rand to dollar. You see we have the increase in demand again. The supply does not respond. The quantity was steady, is now 40, and then the value of rand was 15 rand, is now 15 rand 20, is now 15 rand 50. Let's check. We are comparing the rand to the dollar. Name one exchange rate system. Is the managed or controlled floating exchange rate, or free floating exchange rate, or the fixed exchange rate? Remember, the free one is also called the flexible exchange rate. And then we continue with the next question. Give one reason for shift of the demand for. Give one reason for the shift of the demand curve above. Why did the demand curve shift? Increase in payment for imports of goods from USA, increase in payment for services from USA, increase in spending of SA tourists in the US, South Africans buying shares in US, and then high interest and dividends paid to USA investors in South Africa, high loan repayment of loans from USA. Any other answer was accepted in this case. There are many reasons. Briefly describe the term the foreign exchange. Foreign exchange is the conversion of one currency into another currency. So in this case, we continue. Explain the value of the rand against the US dollar after the shift in the demand curve in the graph above. The rand has decreased in the value against US dollar. The rand has depreciated against US dollar. How can appreciation of the currency be negative? Be negative to the country? The currency appreciation may increase the export expenses. When the country's currency appreciates, the number of commodities exported from that country decreases. This situation can drastically cause the country's GDP to decrease. Also, the data response here, we are given two graphs here, the graph A and graph B. The first graph indicates the increase in the demand. Second one indicates the decrease in the supply. Then let's check, is the rand against the US dollar? Who manages exchange rate policies in South Africa? It is South African Reserve Bank. Which diagram above represents an increase in the number of tourists from US to South Africa? Is diagram A. Briefly describe the term the foreign exchange control. Foreign exchange control refers to policies policies or measures that are undertaken by the South African government to safeguard the currency of the country. So foreign exchange control governs measures taken by the South African Reserve Bank regarding the purchase of the foreign currency. Restrictions applied by the government to ban or limit the sale of or purchase of foreign currency by nationals, and or the sale of or purchase of the local currency by foreigners. Any other answer that is correct was accepted in this situation. How can the South African Reserve Bank correct undervalued currency? When the currency is undervalued, interest rate can be decreased to cause the outflow of foreign currency and drain excess liquidity from the economy and release the inflation pressure. Explain the impact of the rand if the number of tourists from South Africa to US dollar decrease. Use the information on the diagram. A decrease in the number of tourists from South Africa to US will cause a decrease in the demand for dollars. Therefore, USA will decrease the supply of dollars to South Africa. The decreased number of tourists will shift the supply curve from S1 to S2. Consequently, the equilibrium quantity of dollars will reduce from 16 to 12. The initial exchange rate was 16 rand at the quantity of $16, but the decrease in the demand for the dollar increased the value of the dollar to 17 rand at the quantity of 12 for the dollar. The exchange rate will rise as the rand depreciates against the US dollar. So these are discussion questions. Differentiate between the free floating exchange rate and the fixed exchange rate. Free floating, it's a system whereby equilibrium exchange rate is determined by the market forces of demand and supply without any intervention by the government. That's why there is no government intervention. The exchange rate fluctuates as the market conditions change without any limits. This system generally works automatically. Free floating exchange rate can appreciate and depreciate without limits, since no one can set limits in there. It is determined by market forces. And then we continue. The fixed exchange rate. A fixed exchange rate means that the value of the currency is fixed or pegged at a certain level by the state for the given period of time. And then exchange rate is not influenced by market forces. Is not influenced by market forces. Its value is determined by the state or the government. Authorities can devaluate or revaluate the currency. It cannot appreciate or depreciate because of market forces. So mark allocation will be 4 in this case. And then let's check again another question. How can the deficit on the current account affect the economy of South Africa? A current account deficit may mean that the country is not producing its own goods, rather than relies on imports. This will result to decline in economic growth of the country, because that will mean we are not producing more, we are importing. A deficit, therefore, a deficit in the current account may also mean that local firms cannot compete with imports, therefore leading to decline in production, shutting down of local firms, and job losses will occur. And then we continue with the same question. A rising current account deficit leads to an increase in supply of nations' currency in the foreign exchange markets. If a current account deficit is financed through borrowings, it is said to be more unsustainable. This is because borrowing is unsustainable in the long term, and countries will be burdened with high interest payments in the future. Because the country will be facing high debts. If the country is facing high foreign debts, then it will be unable to pay those debts because of high interest rates that are paid. A very high balance of payments deficit may at some point cause a loss of confidence by the foreign investors. 2 marks for examples. 8 marks is allocated, and then complete sentences must be at least 4 to obtain that 8 marks. Mere listing will only be given for will only be allocated for 2 marks if you are listing. This is the higher order question, remember. And then after all this, I thank you, and I believe this lesson will have a great impact as you prepare for your control test. I am Mr. Mhlongo. See you again on the next topic.